And good evening. We begin top story tonight with the terrifying scene inside of an Indiana Walmart. A gunman charging into a break room and shooting at employees. A manager able to escape and call 911. A heroic action police are saying likely saved so many lives. Body camera footage, here it is, shows the moment law enforcement responded to that call running inside of the Evansville store. The officers going aisle by aisle with weapons drawn, hunting for that gunman. The shooter firing on police as they closed in on him. Officers then shooting and killing that man. He's now been identified as 25-year-old Ronald Ray Mosley, a former employee of that Walmart who was fired in 2022. The incident eerily similar to another shooting in November at a Walmart in Chesapeake, Virginia, you may remember. 6 people killed by an overnight manager who walked into the break room again and opened fire. Tonight, police say this incident in Evansville could have been far worse if not for the quick thinking of both the employees and the officers inside. NBC's Jesse Kirsch leads us off tonight.
Tonight, Indiana police releasing body camera footage, which they say shows the frantic search for a gunman inside an Evansville Walmart after he shot an employee in the face before turning his handgun on officers.
Walmart was all cars be advised active shooter.
Investigators say around 10 p.m. last night, Ronald Ray Mosley II fired at police in and outside the Evansville store where he once worked.
Drop it! Drop it! Drop it!
Before police shot and killed the 25-year-old. NBC News spoke with a woman who says her niece, Amber Cook, is the victim, who police say was walking and talking after being shot.
She is still being treated and is in stable condition. However, she will be affected by the shooting for the rest of her life.
Police say just before 10 p.m., about a dozen employees gathered in the break room when Mosley showed up with a handgun. That's when police say Heather Moore bolted from the room, calling 911, then returning to help Cook as the suspect fled.
Heather Moore is an absolute hero. She helps get the victim up, gets her out of the room, takes her into another room, locks the door, turns off the lights, and hid behind some computer equipment.
What do you want to say to the employee who made that 911 call so quickly?
Thank you. You definitely have a co-worker that's life you saved for doing that. Her instincts were absolutely heroic, and we can't thank her enough.
Authorities believe Mosley targeted former colleagues. Police say the suspect worked at this Walmart in 2022 when he assaulted 4 fellow employees before the company fired him. Just hours before last night's shooting, prosecutors say he was in mental health court for that very case. Investigators found a suicide note in his home after the shootout.
All right, Jesse Kirsch joins us tonight. Jesse, what do we know about the gun used in the shooting? As you point out, the suspect had a type of criminal history.
Yeah, Tom, it's what we know and what we don't know, frankly, at this hour. The Evansville police chief tells me he doesn't know how Mosley got the gun allegedly used in this supposed attack. But the police chief also says that even with Mosley's prior plea deal, he would have been able to legally purchase the gun that was used, a 9mm handgun, according to authorities. Tom?
And Jesse, I mean, you reported he had been fired. Do police think that's the motive? He came back as a sort of revenge killing?
Well, all they're saying at this point broadly is that they believe this was a targeted attack. But the police chief did tell me, Tom, that according to an employee told authorities apparently that the 2 people who the suspect singled out, both the female victim who was shot in the face and a male victim, according to authorities, the 2 people that were singled out apparently are part of a group of people that the suspect would play video games with in addition to being co-workers with, or at least, there's that nexus of connection there, and they're trying to figure out how well these people all knew each other, Tom. But again, tonight, authorities are calling this a targeted attack.
Okay,
Tom?
Jesse Kirsch, who leads us off tonight here on a Friday. Jesse, thank you. We want to head overseas now to another big story. A new rift in the alliance supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. Tonight, a split between the U.S. and Germany over sending tanks there. It's tough news for Ukraine, which relies on Western military aid. Richard Engel explains for us.
If Russian President Vladimir Putin can't have Ukraine, he seems content to obliterate it, hoping one day the nation will submit. The daily horrors made today's news from Germany even more bitter. A new crack in the alliance supporting Ukraine, with German and U.S. officials unable to resolve a dispute over sending battle tanks there. Germany resisting, but saying its hesitance is not because the Pentagon won't send American tanks either. Although U.S. officials today insist Germany's hesitance is not because the Pentagon won't send American tanks either. The U.S. is sending $2.5 billion in more ammunition and weapons, including Bradleys and Stryker fighting vehicles. But if tanks are, for now, a step too far, the administration is happy to pile on financial pressure.
The Department of Treasury will be designating Wagner as a significant transnational criminal organization.
Today, sanctioning members of a Russian private security firm, the Wagner Group. It recruits prisoners for frontline duty in Ukraine and is proving more effective than the regular Russian army. Wagner is led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's old confidant and one-time chef, who now doesn't shy away from showing up on the battlefield.
Richard Engel joins us now from London. Richard, we heard there in your report Ukraine is so dependent on foreign weapons. We actually had a representative from Ukraine come to Top Story last week to talk about trying to get America to send over tanks. Explain to our viewers why these tanks from Germany and possibly in one day from the U.S. are so important for the battle there.
It's all about mobility, Tom. For the last several months, the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, have kind of settled into an artillery war, in a war that very much resembles World War I, World War II, fixed positions, a lot of damage, with the two sides firing what are effectively cannons at each other. And U.S. officials who are working with the Ukrainians, advising them, offering friendly consultations, think that over time, the Ukraine could lose that war, because if you're in artillery war with a bigger army, a bigger adversary that has more men and more artillery than you do, that over time you're going to lose, no matter how brave your fighters are and how skilled you are at using that artillery. So they want to increase Ukraine's mobility, fighting vehicles, Bradleys, so they can maneuver, so they can change up the dynamics of the battlefield and do what the Ukrainians have proven to be very good at, which is adapting on the fly, hit and run type of maneuvers, and keeping themselves moving instead of in a fixed, real bloody battle that over time U.S. officials think do not favor the Ukrainian side.
And Richard, before you go, and briefly, if you can, I know there are new concerns about a Russian spy ship off the coast of Hawaii.
It's not as uncommon as you think. Russian ships and other countries' ships often cruise by the United States trying to collect intelligence. This, according to the Pentagon, is a Russian spy ship. The Pentagon believes it is actively collecting or trying to collect intelligence, but it is remaining in international waters and so far is not behaving in any threatening or unprofessional way. But it's out there, and the Pentagon is tracking it through the Coast Guard.
Okay, Richard Engel for us tonight. Richard, appreciate that. Back here at home now to an investigation into a deadly plane crash just outside of New York City. The small plane going down shortly after taking off from JFK Airport, killing both men on board. NBC's Kristen Dahlgren has the chilling moment they realized something was wrong.
The crash touched off a massive search in the woods just north of New York City. Flight control had lost touch with the single-engine plane, less than 2 miles from an emergency landing at Westchester County Airport.
19 Mike Tango, understand you're losing oil pressure?
Yes, we are losing oil pressure. This is an emergency. 19 Mike Tango.
The plane had taken off from JFK Airport about a half hour earlier. Pilot Baruch Taub was bringing his friend Ben Chaffetz home to Ohio from a funeral in New York. The situation dire as the plane lost altitude.
Do you have engine power right now? Are you able to maintain altitude?
No, the engine is over-revving right now. Mayday, 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 mayday.
19 Mike Tango, you want to correct back to the left now for the runway at your 10 o'clock. Radar contact lost.
Neither man survived. Chaffetz was a mechanic who owned a repair shop and had a wife and kids. At 5:27, he texted, "I love you and the kids. We lost engines." The plane went down 1 minute later.
I don't think any of us want to contemplate what it would be like to know that your life was about to end and you were going to speak to the people that you love the most and try to say something to them to summarize the life that you've had together.
Rabbi Eli Skorsky was a good friend of the men.
Ben Chaffetz was always doing for other people with a kind, gracious attitude. He took people into his home to live there, people who didn't have good situations. Just very gracious, good, kind people.
Remembering the two men, not for how they died, but how they lived, with generosity and love. Kristen Dahlgren, NBC News.
We thank Kristen for that very sad story. We want to turn now to power and politics and the road to 2024 already underway. So far, President Trump, the only Republican to officially declare his bid for the White House. But his former UN Secretary Nikki Haley seemed to tease her own plans on Fox News. Take a listen.
When you're looking at a run for president, you look at two things. You first look at, does the current situation push for new leadership? The second question is, am I that person that could be that new leader? Yes, we need to go in a new direction. And can I be that leader? Yes, I think I can be that leader.
Haley, the latest GOP hopeful, seemingly gearing up for a White House run, but can she stand out in what's sure to be a crowded field? Or maybe not. I want to bring in our panel, NBC News political analyst Brendan Buck. He served as a counselor to former House Speaker Paul Ryan and former Speaker John Boehner's press secretary before that, and NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray. Guys, thank you both for joining us on a Friday night. So, Brendan, I'm going to start with you. Haley wasn't in the spotlight as often as some other Trump officials for her UN ambassador position. What are you hearing, at least in GOP circles? Are people excited about the potential for a Nikki Haley run? We know she was also governor of South Carolina, of course.
Yeah, I mean, Nikki Haley was once seen as a rising star in the party. I think the challenge is that at that time, it was a little bit of a different party than it is today. Nikki Haley is what you would consider sort of a traditional Republican, the three-legged stool, social conservative, economic conservative, strong on national security. Party's a little different now. It's more populist on economic issues, much more isolationist on foreign policy issues. So, she's an interesting character who I think there will be some people excited about, but she's got a long way to go. If you look at any polling, she's in single digits. I think the thing that you have to wonder is, if she does get in, does that mean it's open season? And the other question for her, of course, is, do you go around Trump or straight through Donald Trump? That's probably going to be the toughest thing for her. I think you have to be pretty comfortable with the idea that you got to take some swings at the former president and understand he's going to swing back. And I imagine that those are the kind of things that she is debating, whether or not she thinks she can actually topple that person who is known for engaging in a good fight.
Yeah, Mark, Brendan brings up a lot of good points. There really isn't a Nikki Haley buzz out there, at least not in GOP circles, that we've seen reported or really talked about. She stopped short of announcement. As we know, there are very specific FEC rules about election filings and launching a campaign. We are getting close to a time where people are going to have to start announcing. In your opinion, why do you think people are waiting so long, number one? And number two, who do you think still really is going to throw their name in the ring?
Yeah, Tom, we have actually a long ways to go. And while in past cycles, like in 2020, we saw someone like Elizabeth Warren get in early on the Democratic side. In 2008, we saw the John Edwards and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in or about to be in at this stage of the cycle. But I think that this Republican race will at least start to mature by the time we get to the spring. We'll have more candidates and official announcements. It still is very early. And as far as who could actually get in, I'm expecting a wide open field, to be honest with you. Before the Republicans' midterm disappointment, I think there was a really strong possibility that Donald Trump and maybe only a couple of people would end up running. But after the Republicans' disappointment, there probably is the expectation that this could be a wide open field. And what also stands out to me is that Nikki Haley might not be the only Republican who worked for Donald Trump who would end up running. You would end up having someone like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo who could run, as well as former Vice President Mike Pence. And what those candidacies and potential candidates show me is that there is the expectation that Donald Trump could end up being very weak. But of course, as we've often seen, people underestimate Donald Trump at their own peril. And what also stands out to me is that Donald Trump, the former president, will be in Nikki Haley's state of South Carolina next week.
But Mark, don't you think people are just sort of sitting around waiting to see if DeSantis gets in? Everyone knows they're going to have to take on Trump. And here's the problem. As soon as you announce, Trump comes after you. So don't you think some Republicans are playing the waiting game?
Yeah, and there is the expectation that if you really want to be able to defeat Donald Trump, that shortening the game probably benefits you. But you're also exactly right that Ron DeSantis is actually waiting out there. And while, we're talking about Nikki Haley, we're talking about other former Donald Trump in expectation that he being the biggest rival to the former president. But then again, it becomes a math game. If it's a one-on-one race, which I don't think is going to be the case, or is it absolutely wide open and then it's Donald Trump versus everyone else, which looks a whole lot like 2016.
Brendan, I want to go to you now. DeSantis obviously getting a lot of media attention. Everything he does is generating headlines at this point. I want to go to something that apparently happened in the state of Florida this week. DeSantis still sort of leaning into the culture wars, if you will, and blocking an African-American history course from Florida schools. Now, Florida schools impart the administration there in Florida saying, quote, as presented, the content of this course is inexplicably contrary to Florida law and significantly lacks educational value. Now, we can kind of go back and forth about this so-called AP class, whatever it was, but clearly DeSantis has a plan here, correct?
Yeah, Ron DeSantis has differentiated himself not really through policy, but rather through fighting a culture war. And I think you have to look at it in that way. It's not about this class. It's about culture. And you know, he's replicating, I think, probably what you saw relatively successfully with Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, taking on education and you know, the so-called woke left. That sells right now in Republican circles. And Ron DeSantis generates the right kind of enemies. And he knows that. And so he generates these headlines that get everybody all stirred up, and it only creates a bit of a halo for him on the right. So I imagine this is probably the kind of stuff that we have in store. It's not going to be a real debate about issues. It's going to be about culture.
Mark, real quick, because this is short, there was some good reporting earlier this week from Jonathan Martin, I think, in Politico, about DeSantis hosting a big fundraiser for his inauguration and treating donors there, people who donated, I think it was around $25,000 to the re-election campaign. He flew in food from New York City from Carbone, great Italian food. Him and his wife, Glad, hadn't basically, the story was about him getting better at retail politics. Is this what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, you end up having to still charm voters, Tom. And while Brendan's exactly right that the culture war is such a big recipe, deep down, when it comes to those early states that we'd end up seeing in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina on the Republican side, it still does come down to retail politics. And, of course, beyond the culture war, beyond the retail politics, you're probably going to end up hearing Ron DeSantis talk about his 19-point percentage win that he was able to have in Florida in last year's gubernatorial election.
Okay, Mark Murray, Brendan Buck, thanks so much for joining Top Story on this Friday. We do want to stay in politics, though, in the widening scandal involving New York Congressman George Santos. Sources telling NBC News the Republican who has voiced support for anti-LGBTQ legislation performed as a drag queen in Brazil. Now Santos is fighting back against those allegations and others. Garrett Hake has been following this story from the beginning and has this new reporting.
Under investigation and under fire for a growing sea of scandals. New York Congressman George Santos now taking to Twitter to defend himself and to deny reports he performed in drag in Brazil in the late 2000s. Two Brazilian sources tell NBC News that this is Santos, then using the drag name Kitara, seen here being interviewed at a gay pride parade in a suburb of Rio de Janeiro in 2007. Santos, now the first openly gay House Republican, tweeting that any claims he was a drag queen or performed in drag are a, quote, media obsession and categorically false. Santos also pushing back against reporting that he walked away with $3,000 raised on a GoFundMe to pay for surgery for a disabled veteran's service dog, Sapphire. That veteran, Richard Osthoff, telling NBC News that Santos' charity, Friends of Pets United, set up the donation website. But when it came time for the surgery, Osthoff says Santos refused to hand over the money. Osthoff was forced to put Sapphire down instead.
It's disgusting. It's horrible. He should be ashamed of himself, but he doesn't have shame. He's a psychopath.
Santos calling reports he would let a dog die, quote, shocking and insane, adding, these distractions won't stop me. But Santos faces at least 5 different investigations, some by law enforcement, that might. Any criminal indictment or action by the House Ethics Committee could force Santos off his newly assigned committees. And if Santos stays in Congress long enough to face voters again next year, Democrats say they won't be fooled again by his falsehoods.
The election of a complete charlatan like George Santos, who's almost a caricature unto himself, should be a shock and a jolt to the system. It should be a wake-up call for the Democratic Party in New York State.
One of those sources in Brazil who recognized and identified Santos was a Brazilian drag queen named Eula Richard, who described him as having an outsized sense of grandeur and said that he, quote, lied all the time. She told NBC that she was surprised when she learned he'd been elected to Congress. Tom?
All right, Garrett Haake, a lot of reporting there. Still ahead tonight, paramedics charged with murder. The 2 EMS workers accused of killing a man. They were called in to help. Their plea in court today, and the lawsuit just filed by the victim's family. Plus, the new video showing officers racing to save a baby locked in a stolen car in the Florida heat, how they managed to save this child's life. And the new feature just launched on Instagram that parents of teenagers will want to hear about. Could it improve their mental health? Stay with us. Top story just getting started on this Friday. All right, we're back now with an update on a story we first told you about last week. 2 Illinois paramedics appearing in court on murder charges. They're accused of killing a man after strapping him face down on a stretcher. His family now suing them and the ambulance company. Shaq Brewster has this one.
Tonight, 2 paramedics charged with the first-degree murder of Earl Moore Jr. pleading not guilty in an Illinois court. State investigators say Peter Cadigan and Peggy Finley strapped Moore face down on a stretcher during a hospital transport, causing his death. Body camera video from December shows Springfield police officers responding to a call apparently involving people inside of a home with firearms.
There's no one here with guns. Okay. He's hallucinating, he's having alcohol withdrawals.
But after arriving, officers realized the caller needed medical assistance and requested an ambulance.
You want that water?
Paramedics arrived about 15 minutes later.
What happened, stupid?
Refusing to offer more medical assistance, according to the police.
We ain't carrying him. I am seriously not in the mood for this dumb.
Officers helped Moore through the home.
We can get you some help, bud.
Lifting him onto the stretcher, where Cadigan is then seen placing him face down. Prosecutors say the 2 paramedics then tightly strapped him in. Moore, just 35 years old, died about an hour later. His death ruled a homicide.
Cause of death as compressional and positional asphyxia.
Attorneys for both defendants deny any wrongdoing. Finley's attorney telling NBC News her response that night can't in any way be considered a criminal act. Moore's family disagrees.
They tied him down like some kind of animal and killed him. My baby suffocated.
A case now heading to trial, both paramedics facing up to 60 years in prison. And Tom, Moore's family also filed a wrongful death lawsuit. Their attorney, Benjamin Crump, said what he saw in that video was barbaric and wants it to be addressed in both criminal and civil proceedings. Tom?
Okay, Shaq, we thank you for that one. We turn now to some big changes coming to Instagram. The popular app now rolling out new features that will help users manage how much time they spend scrolling and pick the content they see. Senior national correspondent Kate Snow takes a look at the new technology getting noticed by parents.
For the millions of parents whose teens use Instagram all day and night, there's a new tool to help their kids take a break. Quiet mode.
What quiet mode allows you to do is pick times of the day or the week where you don't want to be bothered by Instagram.
Anyone who sends a direct message to someone who's enabled quiet mode is notified that person is not available. And because teens have a fear of missing out, when they come out of quiet mode, they can see everything they missed. Instagram will also send any teen who's using the app for more than a few minutes between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. a message encouraging them to put quiet mode on. The changes come after rising concerns about the impact of social media use on children and teens. Instagram's own internal research found 1 in 3 teenage girls who were experiencing body image issues said Instagram made them feel worse, though the company says a majority of teen users felt that Instagram either had no impact or made things better.
Tonight, when my daughter gets home from school, I will be talking about quiet mode.
Chris McKenna is a dad of 4 and the founder of internet safety group Protect Young Eyes. His take on the changes?
So what I like about this is I'm always going to applaud anything that prompts teens to make better choices online. But at the end of the day, Kate, this is still a feature that has some dependencies. It depends on parents being involved to help their children make these choices.
Instagram did some other things, too. They created ways to give users more control over what content is pushed toward them on Instagram. So now you can block certain words. You can say, I don't want to see videos or posts that have those words in the caption. You can also select things that Instagram thinks you would like, and you can say, not interested. Like if you're a teen and you don't want to see videos about weight loss, for example, you can stop that flow coming at you, Tom.
25 years after the Clinton impeachment, we're joined now by Tony Llamas. She was a reporter for the Washington Post during the Clinton impeachment. In fact, she's on the byline for the first story reported by the Post on this topic. She's now a professor of journalism at Washington and Lee University. Tony, thanks so much for joining Top Story tonight. I kind of want to go back to the beginning and jog your memory a little bit and ask you sort of pretty bluntly, would the story have ever been published? Would this story have ever come out if Drudge doesn't come out with the story that that Newsweek is sitting on a story about an affair involving President Clinton?
I think it would have, because we were working it. We were working it that weekend before, and we were chasing it. We knew something was going on, and we were calling, making calls. I was monitoring the grand jury floor at the federal courthouse. We knew something was up the Friday before.
Talk to me about the conversations within the newsroom, if you can, because back then there was almost this unspoken rule sometimes with the White House press corps and really political journalists in general that affairs, especially by the president, sometimes weren't covered. There were presidents in the past that had affairs, and it was never really reported. Was there ever any sort of newsroom battles about getting this story out?
No, I don't recall anything like that. And the reason, Tom, was because the special counsel had gone to the three-judge panel at the federal courthouse and asked for an expansion of his mandate to investigate President Clinton for obstruction of justice and other charges. So this reached the level of a legal issue, not just an affair.
Looking back on the reporting there, it was sort of seen through the prism, if you think this is fair, it was sort of all seen through the prism of the president. Of course, he's the commander-in-chief, and that's why it was such a major story at the time. But in looking back, were there serious mistakes made in the way that Monica Lewinsky was covered and treated and seen?
Absolutely. I do believe that. And we didn't have the terminology. We didn't have the language back then to articulate what the Me Too movement brought up recently. And that is the power dynamic. And when Monica came to our campus a couple of years ago, and she and I talked, and I honestly believe that she really had her life destroyed because and Clinton didn't. Yeah, he took a lot of political heat, but Monica Lewinsky, has not had her life back. I mean, she didn't. And we didn't have the language to say that, this was a woman, a young woman, very young woman, 21, 22 years old, and not much older than my students. And that is what is different for me.
And Tony, I mean, and I get it. It was a different time. And I also wonder, though, you're a woman who was covering this. And yes, it was a much different time. It wasn't the time of Mad Men, but it was still a different time in the newsroom. Was this ever brought up? I mean, were these conversations ever had, or were sort of ignored, or not even explored?
I think that there was just this frenzy, this political frenzy, that this was the president of the United States, and the sordid details that came out, that just took on a life of its own. And there was just nothing that was going to stop that train. Nothing.
A lot of people say this was a turning point in journalism, right? Especially in political journalism. I think that can be debated, especially with the story that you're telling tonight. But do you think political reporting got better or it got worse after the Monica Lewinsky affair and Bill Clinton?
I think worse. I mean, because the standards were lowered. The bar was lowered. It was. And I think it has gotten worse.
But when you say the bar is lowered, in what sense? Do you not think that what happened was newsworthy?
I do. But I think that the focus, should have been, could have been different. in terms of, the women, and this is typical of what happens to women when there's a powerful man involved, and she takes the blame for what he did, and the thing is that Monica was an intern, when this happened, and that power dynamic, it wasn't appreciated back then like I think it would be today.
Finally, you've had 25 years to think about this. You're a professor now. What did you learn from covering that story?
I think I learned that there's more to it. I think that the politics, in a place like Washington, D.C., politics is everything. It is the industry, the main industry. And I think that maybe if it happened again, I hope it wouldn't be worse, but I'm not optimistic that it wouldn't be worse today.
Explain. What do you mean worse? The details?
Well, I think that the details, I think that there's the ability for more people to weigh in, on Twitter, on TikTok. And I think that it might have been even far worse in terms of the way that the sordid details were magnified. I think that would have been far worse.
Tony Losi, who was on the front lines of that reporting 25 years ago. Tony, thank you. And coming up, the deadly soccer stampede overseas, fans trying to climb over the walls of a stadium in Iraq. What witnesses say caused the chaos. That's next. Welcome back to Top Story. Time now for Global Watch. And the deadly stampede outside a soccer stadium in southern Iraq. New video shows fans climbing the walls outside the stadium, trying to get in to see Iraq take on Oman in the Arabian Gulf Cup. The stampede killing at least 2 people and injuring dozens more. Witnesses say a lack of organization caused that stampede. Now to the unrest in Peru we've been following all week. Violence spilling onto the streets of the capital city of Lima. The new video shows police firing tear gas and clashing with protesters. Authorities also investigating if a massive fire, you see it here in the city, was set by demonstrators. More than 50 people have been killed so far in this unrest that began after the ousting of former President Pedro Castillo last month. And park rangers in northeast Australia discovering a potentially record-setting giant toad. The cane toad, dubbed Toadzilla. Look at that back on that thing. Weighing in at 6 pounds, twice the average size for the species. The toads were introduced to Australia to control pests but have become an invasive species. Toadzilla was euthanized and donated to the Queensland Museum for further research. Okay, that does it for us here on Top Story. Thanks so much for watching this week. I'm Tom Llamas in New York. Stay right there. More news on the way.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.